Hello everyone, welcome to Swabhimaan's fourth edition on representations of sexuality and gender in India. Today, we are here with Tejaswi Subramaniam, a digital content creator from Gaysi, to discuss the nuances of gender and sexuality in digital spaces. Gaysi Family is a media platform and safe zone for queer desis that was formed in 2008. I quote, Gaysi's platform amplifies individual voices, stories, and experiences, enabling more people to mediate on and relate to what it means to be queer. Tejaswi here is a journalist, researcher, and facilitator whose attention is captured by human relationships at a time of the Internet of Things. Their special interests lie in public health, pleasure, and a sense of unbridled freedom to love and connect beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right. We're here today to discuss the various relationships between personal and social identity creation, queerness, and the realm of the digital, which includes pop culture, film, television, and the like. So, firstly, Tejaswi, hello. As a media platform of
Hi,
Gaysi
Lily.
that focuses on amplifying queer voices, how does Gaysi engage with the community at a ground level?
Thank you so much for having me here. And that's an interesting question because Gaysi actually comes out of a need for pop culture that was represented. Gaysi started way back. It's 13 years old now. It turned 13 in November last year. And it started as a bunch of queer young folks just coming together and understanding and acknowledging that their voices, that their lives, their stories were not being represented in pop culture, not represented in the mainstream media, and to kind of use the space that the internet has provided to build that, right?
Mhm.
So I have actually worked as a journalist even outside of Gaysi, even before Gaysi. So I've always felt the need for the queer lens to be applied across all sorts of news reports, all sorts of media representation, all sorts of media critique. And I've always felt like there was never the space to do that, probably because the management was open to that, or because of certain regulations in the country, which would lead to the media house being marginalized or sidelined by algorithms on various social media platforms and such. So I feel like we are just beginning to embrace queer narratives in the Indian subcontinent and like South Asia as well. People are coming out and people are able to reflect about themselves as queer people in a queer sense. And when I say queer, it's not always about sexuality and gender, right? There is a lot of other ways in which we relate to one another and ourselves, which is not necessarily aligned with the mainstream norm of cis heteronormativity, right? For
Mhm.
instance, when we talk about the marital rape, the issue of marital rape rather in India, we talk about, of course, there are a lot of people who are queer in their sexuality who are probably in marriages that are not suited to their orientation, but there are also a lot of people who are ace and who might not be comfortable engaging in sexual encounters, sexual interactions, but they are not necessarily people who don't want to stay married, don't want the companionship or the other, um, things that marriage offer, other comforts and conveniences that marriage offers. So we are just scratching the surface, just the tip of the iceberg where we are at when we talk about queerness and media representation today. And at Gaysi, we are trying to explore that further. With each year, with each passing year, we are kind of uncovering new ways of being queer that are inclusive of people with disabilities, people across, the caste hierarchies that is very common, that's quite common in the Indian society, and that has been exported into the world outside as a result of it. And, also across races, across genders, across all sorts of experiences. So we are just scratching the surface and we're trying to get more and more inclusive. But of course, given the platform, given the nature of the platform, given the language that we use, that is English, it's still quite limited. And yeah, so, and we feel like we are, doing radical work in comparison to the mainstream. But when we reflect on our own work, we realize that we have a longer way to go.
I think that's to blame on the realm of the digital in that case, when it comes to accessibility and as well as the digital divide when it comes to barriers in language and accessibility. We're talking about the representation of queer individuals in media platforms and how the mainstream does not have an inclusive lens or an inclusive approach to identity. That is. So do you think in the current atmosphere of film and TV within India or even outside the subcontinent is can shape individual perceptions on sexual and gender identity, especially as with the lack of sex education in India and sexuality education, we often turn to pop culture to understand ourselves better and to reflect on who we are. So do you think the current atmosphere facilitates that?
Not the responsibility of pop culture, and I hate that we have to look towards pop culture for clues towards these very basic aspects of our learning and education, and like in a formative sort of a mind space that we expect these sort of information to be passed on to us, for us to be able to access information in a safe way, in a way that kind of addresses our questions, addresses our identities and things like that. But of course, nonetheless, we do that, and I have been fairly new to this. I won't say I'm someone who has, approached or consumed pop culture throughout my life looking for queer evidences, simply because I'm also autistic. So I'm not someone who watches a lot of pop culture. I'm also someone who reads. Uh, but having said that, I do know that a lot of my friends have found queer references, have found queer, symbols in pop culture throughout. It's like, it's like the treasure hunt. It's been left around, and people who spot the symbol, people who align themselves or who kind of resonate with it have managed to pick it up nonetheless. Uh, but yeah, like to answer your question more directly, is pop culture doing that? Yeah, in some ways it is. For instance, I don't know if you watch Sex Education, but that was like a huge show. I mean, a huge production that kind of changed how we sexuality, how we talked about young people's sexuality more than anything else. Because at the end of the day, we still find it taboo to talk about sexuality when it comes to young people. Younger folks are the people, that's the time when you're exploring it, in an unbridled way, in a very curious manner, and in a manner where you're trying to learn about it. But we kind of cut it short and we say no, abstinence only, celibacy, and we're talking about it in certain very limited ways. But sex education really changed that. I think a lot of older audiences started watching it and started to reclaim um, their own journeys when they were younger people. And now, of course, there are a lot of sex educators on Instagram as well who are kind of using reels and using media formats that the algorithm is promoting, so as to be able to talk about these issues. So I think we're finding, like I said, even throughout the history of pop culture, people have found their clues. And even today, we are managing to kind of sneak past the algorithm and do that, and keep the conversation going, whether it is pop culture, whether it is media that is supplied via OTT platforms, or it is Instagram and all of the other social media platforms that are more accessible for creators who, who aren't that huge. So, yeah.
So when we're talking about the masses and the social implications of media and pop culture and literature and film, there are many movies like Margarita with a Straw, or
Mhm.
even let's say Shubh Zyada Savdhan, that look into queer relationships. So even though I don't completely agree with a few representations in a few mainstream Bollywood movies, what do you think these
Mhm.
movies are getting right? Especially with movies like Chandigarh, Kare Aashiki or Shubh Zyada Savdhan. But on the other hand, we also have movies like Lakshmi that peddle really regressive stereotypes. It was a recent Akshay Kumar movie that
Yeah.
came out on Hotstar. I did not watch that.
Yeah.
I chose not to watch that. But how do you think cinema can shift the dialogue for adequate representations of the LGBTQ plus community? And how do you think these movies are getting it right, if they are, in Bollywood?
I haven't actually watched any of these movies, only because like I'm not very adventurous when it comes to these things, because I feel like there are very triggering elements, and that's just not in the headspace that I am in when I'm watching these movies. However, having said that, I really feel like there is a problem of gaze, there is a problem of accessibility of resources to people to make these movies. At the end of the day, the production houses are still run by people who have a certain kind of socioeconomic location. Even if they might be queer, they might not necessarily understand other lens, of socioeconomic differences that people have. Um, And also there is this idea of entertainment that we peddle through cinema, through a lot of mainstream art and culture, that I feel like really needs to move away. It's not just it's not just entertainment. It is also telling stories. It's also a way of connecting, and we haven't really embraced that in the mainstream, right? And I feel like the gaze is a huge problem. For instance, I watched Batman movie, and I don't know why, but I really went into it expecting like, okay, this Batman is going to be queer friendly, or he's going like this movie is going to be affirming of the climate crisis that is unfolding upon us, and we are all talking about therapy, so why can't we have a Batman who goes to therapy, right? And then at the end of the day, right? And after I watched the movie, I was like, I cannot believe they made it seemed like a 1970 Batman that was just adapted with minor changes in the script to a 2022 audience, right? For instance, they did not address race relations, and if you see, Catwoman is black, right? She's played by Zoe Kravitz, and I think there was just one allusion to it where she says something about white privileged people. That's about it, and that was a very superficial way of writing that character, I felt. And yeah, so when you think about it, at the end of the day, why was it the way it was? The movie could not have passed the Bechdel test in any measure. And when I thought about it, it was because it was made again by a white cis man who is able-bodied, who still sees a superhero from a certain idealistic, outdated, obsolete lens, right? On the other hand, I have seen people write incredibly imaginative characters, incredibly imaginative scripts, like Octavia Butler, where she wrote about race relations and also wrote science fiction built around it, that was constructed around race relations in a very subtle manner. She's not using, theory that is not possible for people to, you know, uh, understand or access without a certain understanding of without having read certain books or things like that. It's very intuitive, and that's a shift in lens that we really need at this day and age. And it's really sad that it's not happening at all. But when we think about it, there are certain power structures that percolate into the media, and those are the ones that gatekeep these kinds of talents, these sorts of voices that are alternative to the cis male gaze, that aren't really allowed to, into the writer's room, that aren't really allowed to write their own characters or fund their own movies, right? It still is a huge issue when it comes to resource accessibility. And yeah, I think that is something that we cannot address this, we cannot critique media without critiquing the socioeconomic structure that keeps capitalism going, that keeps these sorts of organizations working as they have been for several decades. So yeah.
I think it's also I haven't watched Batman yet since I'm on campus, so I don't have access to a theater. But I think when it comes to talking about superheroes, especially in the Marvel or DC cinemas, you're following this heteropatriarchal identity. That you want to be a masculine superhero with a savior complex who saves women and other people. And they try to, I think movies like in Marvel and DC, they try to have representation, but it's so performative when it comes to race, especially when you talk about Zoe Kravitz. I think, I mean, she's a great actor and all of that, but when you can see it in the writing that they're not even trying to represent other communities and other perspectives.
And as an individual, she has limited agency in that, right? Like, it is big enough for her to be cast in it and for her to take up that space. But then there are still structures behind it that still limit, her entire performance and her character itself. Yeah, I hear you. Just to add to that, since you're on the topic of Batman, my friend made a really interesting comment. Even if you were to look at, the gender binary on screen, how it's represented, Batman's suit is designed to make the actor to look bigger. Whereas when it comes to Catwoman's suit, or whether it was Halle Berry or whether it was Zoe Kravitz in the latest edition, it is make the character look smaller, like more petite, And why do we have that distinction? Like, why didn't you have somebody consulting on that? Do we? The other day I saw a Tumblr account with a handle that said "buff girlfriend," and I've never related to anything more than that. And we have these two alternative universes, like there is whatever Batman being produced in a Gotham where these sort of questions, these sort of ideas are not being discussed, and then there is the Tumblr, universe where these ideas are like just everywhere. So it's very clear that there is a division between these two worlds, and there is no interaction that is allowed to happen, right? So yeah, that was just an
I
observation.
think, we were talking about representation in media. I think you were talking about your friends making a movie.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
So basically in India, whether it's Bollywood or I'm from South India, so I also watch movies in languages down south. I don't really see queer characters being written by queer folks. It's not just about who is essaying the roles. For instance, we talked about Lakshmi, and I don't want to write off Akshay Kumar or any other actor as being cishet, right? We never really know who is markedly cishet, and I hate the idea of coming out before you're able to be accepted in the community. So I will not write any of them off as cishet, but I will definitely say there are people who are probably not in touch with their queerness, because at the end of the day, these queer roles, these characters are still being delivered in a manner that are not really how they were over the past few decades, which is either they are tropes of like for comic effect or for spook, for the horror effect of it. But transness is actually an extremely human experience. So to write characters, to deliver characters, to portray characters in a very human way, we don't just need people who are trans or queer to be acting them, but also trans and queer who are probably writing these stories. For instance, I mentioned my friends who are working on a film project that they put their heart, soul, and their own money into, to write about two queer characters who are in love, but at the end of the day, they're also discovering their own individuality and discovering their own personhood in the context of the global pandemic that as it began to unfold in 2020. So yeah, there is more to queer people than just falling in love, like I talked about. There is more to queer. There is a much more holistic human experience that a lot of us have that had nothing to do with just romantic monogamous relationships. Although that is definitely an aspect of some of our lives, it's not something that is so widely relatable. And yeah, so that's the thing. We still we're barely scratching the surface, even when you're making movies like that or writing characters like that. We are actually going the opposite direction of it. We are not still able to understand how queerness happens to the most cishet, how in so many ways queerness is so natural to us. We have just been prohibited by systems and how the systems have been designed from exploring it and expressing it. For instance, children, why are children made to wear gendered clothes, gendered uniforms in schools? We kind of try to impose gender norms on them so early on without really helping them explore what it is and how they want to express their gender or their experience of it. So yeah, there are a lot of systemic issues that kind of stop us, and some of us pull back and conform to those systems and are not able to express our queer selves. So those are probably not the people who should be writing or saying these roles, is what I'd say.
So that's when it comes to film. When it comes to film, I feel like you have more agency to build a character. But what about representation in advertisements? I think there was a recent ad where it showed two people, I think two women in a relationship, and they were performing a Karwa Chauth tradition. So when it comes to representation, but you're still conforming to these patriarchal traditions of Karwa Chauth, of giving to love, in a way, as you said, representations of love. What do you think about performativity in that way? Do you think representation in this way, especially when it comes to advertisements, just like throwing a queer element here and there, will make it more holistic? That's what these advertisement companies and even film production, when it comes to that, that's what they think. So what is your opinion on that when it comes to rainbow washing or tokenism?
That's what I mean when I say, queerness is not just about people, the universe is queer. When you bring in the lens of queerness to write a story, to write to write a film, produce a film, the whole universe changes, because the way queer people, queerness moves through our lives, moves through spaces, everything gets redefined. Instead, like you rightly pointed out, what a lot of these productions do is they just try to introduce a queer element and just contain queerness to that small part of the film or small part of the production. But that's not at all how it happens, right? Is queerness is an aesthetic, queerness is a feeling, queerness is a style, queerness is an approach to filmmaking. It's not just in the characters that are written. I do remember writing about that ad that was portraying two women who were wedded to each other as observing Karwa Chauth. And it was sort of for a fairness ad, right? And I had
Mhm.
written about how a lot of the queer movement, a lot of the queer leadership in our country today, and even in the yesteryears, has been from trans women, has been from queer folks of, us oppressed castes and oppressed communities, right? And a lot of these castes and communities, although it's not a blanket statement that they're all darker skin, but a lot of these castes and communities are constitute people of a certain skin color, right? And so there is a colorism aspect to it as well.
Mhm.
And for us to say that queerness can only be accepted if it fits a certain mold of beauty, which is cis heteronormative, which is Brahminical, which is Eurocentric, I don't think I want to be part of that narrative as a queer person, right? Having said that, when I wrote that piece and it was published on Gaysi, we did receive a ton of comments from a lot of queer folks who said that they found it relatable. But just a few days before I think the ad came down, very ironically, it was because of critique from nationalist groups, critiques from certain right wing groups, as they felt like Karwa Chauth was being co-opted by the queer lens. Whereas as a queer person, I felt like queerness was being co-opted by the Brahminical lens and capitalist norms. So that was quite an ironic situation that we faced. But yeah, so I don't necessarily like the idea of it. It's like I said, queerness changes aesthetic, changes style, queerness changes the voice that is telling the story and then the story itself. You can't just introduce queer elements to the same old, ideas of beauty, ideas of ritual, ideas of love. So yeah, and then call
Yeah,
it an ad.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And when you're talking about ads and film, it's usually everything we consumer produce ends up being political. So
yeah.
when we are talking about politics and queer identity, what do you think about, especially in the past few years with the pandemic, what do you think about digital activism and participatory culture on the internet? Do you think that has helped in any way in expression or
I don't know how much it has helped, but for people like me, I know a lot of other people who were trapped in their homes, who lost their jobs, who had to move back in with their, birth families because of resource crunches, because of not being able to afford rents in a different city, etc., etc. They definitely felt seen. I definitely felt seen. I was living with my mother in a smaller city. It was largely queer phobic town. A trans woman I was living in Coimbatore, and a trans woman was murdered in, I think, December 2020 when I was there. And that was so scary for me to hear, that it was a reminder that people are murdered in that city. People are murdered in that part of the world. Actually, Tamil Nadu witnesses a great deal of murders of trans women, especially in temples, So it's by priests and certain men, certain cis men who are in power. So it continues to happen, and that's the scary part. So I think that was when I would retreat into a digital space. As much as I hate it, as much as I hate the screen life, there's this joke that I'm sure you've read, you've seen in memes as well. But the fact that we're just moving on from a bigger screen to a smaller screen through the day and calling it a life. As frustrating as that is, I think the digital world has been a place of, respite for a lot of us to find our queerness, to kind of reclaim our queerness, and to also feel seen. Clubhouse where people could talk, and not just read, and even Twitter Spaces. A lot of these spaces are definitely holding space for a lot of queer narratives to come out, to be shared, and to be validated. But I feel like at the end of the day, we definitely do have to translate it into our real life. At the end of the day, we are all people living in a physical reality, and yeah, that safety, that idea of it is so important because, like, most recently, for instance, in Ukraine, there is a trans woman whose narrative has come out in the media, and I think she's quite popular. She's a singer, and I think she has a huge following on Twitter and Instagram, and therefore her voice came out, and she talked about how she's a trans woman, and but a lot of her official documents still um, identify her as male. And in Ukraine, the country is drafting all male identified people into their army to fight the Russian aggressions. So even though someone like her could take to Twitter and tweet about her plight, she was also talking about how she's not able to leave her house to buy groceries or to find herself food. It's still like really sad that she's not able to access food. She's not able to access physical community, someone to hold her because she's also going through a really hard time living in Kiev. So yeah, at the end of the day, we do have to translate it into the real world. And some of us who are able to show up because of our privileges, because of our abilities, I do more to kind of make it happen in our real life and in the structural sense as well.
Yes, and when you're talking about, especially when you talk about the constant cultural production that occurs on the internet, I think the internet gives us the voice, the ability to voice who we are and create, forums and spaces that we feel comfortable in participating in, right? But in the internet or even digital spaces in the bigger picture, they usually are counterpart to the heteropatriarchal structures in society. A lot of these forums, especially on Reddit or even Twitter, they're male dominated, and they usually end up suppressing other voices, let's say, of the marginalized when it comes to queer, caste, class, agenda, and so on. So I know that algorithms and so on sustain these narratives, but do you think, a constant cultural production through spaces, Twitter spaces or Clubhouse, do you think these can break through the power structures prevalent on the internet?
Short answer, no, which is exactly why I'm saying that we must translate it into our real lived lives, and human interactions that are happening in the physical realm. These are highly limited, and at the end of the day, there is a concept of algorithmic bias, which I first came across. I started off my career in economics, and I graduated around the time when we were just recovering from the subprime crisis across the world. So one of the greatest recessions of the recent decades, right? And I remember learning about algorithmic bias that was at the core of algorithmic trading, which had led to the subprime recession. And now it's been 10 years since then, and now I'm working in the media, and I still see how algorithmic bias keeps us from engaging in a very authentic online. Because at the end of the day, like you said, like when that the Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey was given a poster by, I think, a trans woman that said, smash this Brahminical patriarchy India. And when he held it up, there were so many folks who were like, the queer agenda is fine, but the caste agenda, we don't really appreciate it. How can you talk about Brahminical patriarchy? How can you highlight the Brahminical aspect of patriarchy, for instance? But as someone who has a Brahminical background, I would still call out Brahminical patriarchy. And I would probably, and I get it, like they probably don't like it coming from white people, but why can't white people criticize and show their solidarity with certain classes? And then he took it down, and I believe he apologized, right? So that happens. That is the creator of Twitter. That is someone who founded Twitter, I believe. I think he created Twitter, and he's the CEO. He's the current executive lead of it as well. And if he were silenced from talking about or from expressing his solidarity for a certain, then one can imagine what happens to people who are off these identity markers, right? And another thing that happens very commonly is if we report certain transphobic, misogynistic posts on Instagram, for instance, a lot of times nothing happens, nothing really gets done. The community guidelines, which I don't know, at some point we all have to just sit and review it in a classroom, I guess, don't seem to be watertight when it comes to transphobic comments, don't seem to be watertight when it comes to allowing misogynistic content. But when it comes to certain things like nudity of the female, like the breasts, things like that, the community guidelines like so instant. They'd be like, you're taken down, you're shadow banned, and we might just delete your account in the coming days, right? So we see the algorithmic bias play out in these ways as well. There is a lot of bullying that happens. There is a lot of transphobic content and comments that are come up online, and reporting them doesn't really do much. And at the end of the day, we still have to engage online, right? Because, like I said, for a lot of us, it becomes a respite from real life, which already has its own structural systemic issues. So, yeah, algorithmic bias is a huge issue that is suddenly affecting literally every aspect of our lives in our digital world, in our technology focused, technology emphatic world. So, yeah.
And especially when you're talking about, sorry, when you talk about bigoted comments or transphobic comments, queerphobic comments, it's usually also encouraged by the sense of anonymity that the internet holds. I feel like anyone can comment on anyone's post and just not take any responsibility for it because they're not physically present to, face the consequences of shading, like throwing hate on someone, which is, I don't think justifiable in any means. Trolling. So how do you think, especially on the internet, which can be a very dangerous space as well when it comes to trolls and bullies, how do you think it can facilitate the creation of safe spaces? I think you already mentioned Clubhouse and spaces, but how do you think you can filter out these comments?
I think we need to have I think the only way is to queer technology. Get technology that queer people make, that people of certain identity markers that have been oppressed and historically oppressed make. And that technology may not necessarily look like screens. May not necessarily mimic the same kinds of frameworks or kinds of aesthetics or even the functionality of technology that has been passed on to us by them, but it takes a different form. So this is my imagination. And given the vision of our screen life, I would say that we do need to have more people who are queer affirmative, trauma aware, who are able to hold spaces hold attention for grief and hold attention that at the end of the day, we really want to just hold each other. For instance, when I'm in the therapy room, the experience is so different. Whereas now therapy is online, and I can see that my therapist is trying to make more effort to be more cognizant of my physical reality, right? So we definitely need more resources in online spaces. Right now, online spaces are kind of promoted as a very convenient holding space, but that's not how it is. Online spaces actually require us to put in more resources that are more aware of people's discomfort, to be able to engage with people on the sidelines if they are facing discomfort, if they are in a particular situation that kind of could trigger them, even as they are participating in an online classroom or workshop. So we definitely need more facilitators who are A, aware of these nuances, and B, we need more of them. We need more people. It needs to be a growing army. So that's like a two-pronged answer that I have. First of all, queer tech at its root. That is my radical answer. But we also need to be able to figure out other ways of queering these spaces given the circumstances we currently have.
I think when we talk about queering these spaces, it also applies to film, television, and media, pop culture. Like our conversation has been.
So recently, recently I was reading about how there are intimacy consultants who kind of consult with people who are sex workers, people who are actors in the porn industry, people who are directing these movies, just to make sure that consent is still there. Consent at the end of the day is not just transactional payment of money to someone, but it's also like how safe they feel in returning to that workplace later, how safe they feel in their own agency in shaping the creative direction of the film that's being made, things like that. So we need more such people, and we need these people to be paid for their time, and we need our budgets to reflect those gaps. So yeah.
I think that's all I had for today. I think we covered a very wide range of topics within the
I
arena
think we
of
did.
digital space. But it was really interesting speaking with you. Would you like to leave a few concluding comments for us?
I love that you're doing this as a student, and I love that you're taking these initiatives. These are things that I used to wish I could do as a student myself. So I think keep questioning, stay open-minded, and yeah, also stay safe from the virus and generally in life. I'm glad. I hope you're getting the support that you require, and I hope you're getting the resources that you require to be able to explore these topics in a meaningful way. That it's not just abstract and theoretical, but also reflected in your own lives.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that would be a sort of a message that I'm concluding this with.
I think that's all right then, Tejasvi. Thank you so much for coming along today. And I've had a great time talking to you in the past hour.